Perfect. So we'll keep continuing into a lot of these. Again, you definitely will see in practice, like if you're doing preparation, but some of these may be a little more obscure in the actual having to create the form. But there's a lot of knowledge and power just understanding what should be on here, how it should be filled out. So the 1099Bs, we see these are often our big, investment firms and investment companies have to fill out these forms. Proceeds from broker and barter exchange transactions. But do you know that those little barter exchanges, that's supposed to be on here as well? We do have an online fillable Poppy B and C for this. It has the red line form that we have to send to the IRS along with that 1096. So if we look at, we know the due dates are, well, for everybody else, we say, okay, normally January 31st, but this one is weird. They have all the way until February 15th. They're giving extra time on this one to give to the recipient. So it's still the same format up here where you have the payer and the payer's ID and the recipient's ID. But here's one that doesn't have to be furnished to the recipient by January 31st. So it's kind of one of those things, again, in practice, it's good to know. If you have clients that receive 1099Bs, well, it's more February 15th is kind of that due date that they can expect the forms by. You still have the same due date to supply them to the IRS, though. That is February 28th, and if it's electronic, April 1st. But to the recipient, they allow just a few more days, 15 more days in there. So that's just something to know in there. There's a lot of different types of investment information that goes on here. And again, this is a little more complex than we wanted to go into for just one form instruction. But most of them aren't really all that bad if you just read what it has in there. So like these check boxes here. Is it short-term? Is it a long-term gain or loss? Is it ordinary income? Here again, box 4, federal tax withheld. So no matter where it is on the form, it seems if you have a spot that needs to report federal income tax withheld, it's box 4. If they have to go through and we end up here 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, 1E, 1FG. So they put a lot of letters in order to make that happen, but box 4 always ends up being our federal tax withheld. If it's a non-covered security, non-covered meaning that basis is not reported to the IRS, then it has the checkbox there. If it's reported to the IRS, gross proceeds, net proceeds. If it is a loss not allowed, based on amounts in 1D. So there's a lot of checkboxes that, depending on the investment, most of them will be pretty straightforward for laying out on here. Profit or loss realized in 2018 on closed contracts. Unrealized profit or loss on open contracts through December 31st to 17. So most of these, just by reading the boxes, you kind of get a feel for what needs to be in there. If it's proceeds from collectibles, bartering, box 13. These aren't really used as often as they probably should be. That box 13 probably happens a little more in real life. It's the cash you received or the fair market value of any property or service received, and any trade credits or scrip credited to you by your account by a barter exchange. So there is a lot of information that goes into these. There is the short instructions are right on the forms itself. If you go right to the forms, you'll see as part of their forms they have instructions for a recipient. Within each of those, it's kind of nice as they explain a little bit of each of the boxes. So if you're like, well, okay, what is box 8 here? What does that really mean? It is in their instructions, shows the profit or loss realized on regulated futures, foreign currency, or Section 1256 open contracts closed during 2018. We're like, okay, that makes a little more sense. So there's a wealth of information just in the instructions for the recipient section that accompanies each one of these forms. So I definitely encourage you, if you're just doing it because you're fascinated with learning, which maybe you're not exactly like me, but I like to absorb lots of weird little facts and details like that. So it really can help to explain what each of the separate little boxes are for. The 1099 CAP. Now you notice this was not a red line form. And it is due to low volumes of these forms processed each year by the IRS. They're like, we won't even make you do the red line form. You're actually allowed to file a paper copy of this form, like black and white, with the IRS as well as with the shareholders. So yeah, you can still do the online fillable version for them, but it's an extra bonus. You don't have to order any special red line forms for this. This one can actually be filled out and sent to the IRS in a black and white paper form. So there are a few of those that's so low volume, even from the IRS side, that they are not going to require you to do the red line form. So what is this exactly? And this is a relatively newer form, generally speaking. So a corporation in which you own stock had a change in control or capital structure. They're supposed to send you the statement by January 31st after the year change. You've received the statement because the corporation has determined that you might be required to recognize gain from cash or stock or other property exchanged for the corporation stock. So here, that's the circumstances that make this happen. A lot of the other basics are still here, except now it's corporation's name and shareholder's name is the same sort of format. So this is the person creating the form. This is the one receiving it. So none of that really changes, just the wording does. So date the stock was exchanged, the amount of the fair market value of the stock or the property received, the number of shares that you held which were exchanged in the transaction, the class of stock exchanged. And then you'll notice in some of these forms they just have sometimes weird, I guess, grayed out boxes. They reserve those for future reporting purposes, so they don't have to ultimately change the whole entire design. They can add in more line numbers in the future. So it has a box 5. You can put general notes in there. There's nothing that has to be put in here for IRS purposes, but you'll notice if you see that sometimes grayed out boxes or what looks like empty space, they're just reserving that for future reporting purposes. So that's what it's to be used for. It may not be that you maybe come across too many occasions, but if you do work with corporations, there may be a requirement that you may have to do that if there is a little bit of change in capital structure. So it doesn't mean it's impossible. It's helpful to know that this exists because you may have to report that. Next, we have the 1099-G. This is for certain government payments. So unless you're working with a government entity, it may not be that you create these, but it's good to know what they are for. Same sort of layout again. Payer and recipient. Again, you want the tax ID number to match the recipient name exactly. So what kind of things may a government entity report? Well, it may report in box 1, that's unemployment compensation paid to you. Now, this is, normally those who are paying out unemployment compensation. This is going to be state agencies usually. What about a state or local income tax refund or credit or an offset? That's going to be box 2. So if you received some sort of a income tax refund or an offset of some kind, it goes into this box. And talking about the taxability is a different topic, of course, but we're just kind of like interpreting what all these boxes are for. Again, box 4, federal income tax withheld. If there's taxes taken out on it and paid in to the IRS, it goes into box 4. And then we have some other types of things, maybe not as common, but it may be, let's say for box 3, it's the year. What year did this refund? What if it wasn't the most recent tax year? What if it was much earlier? Then they're identifying what that year is. Again, we cover what box 4 is, of course. Or if you had withholding out of your unemployment compensation, you'll see that is a common occurrence, withholding from unemployment. In box 5, it is a reemployment trade adjustment assistance. So that's what RRTA is. I know some of these abbreviations, if you've never come across that. Reemployment Trade Adjustment Assistance that you may have received. And box 6, that is for taxable grants received from a federal or state or local government. 7 is taxable Department of Agricultural payments. So that's where those are supposed to be. If it is anyone other than Department of Agricultural, it means that you have received a payment as a nominee that is taxable to you, like we talked about nominee payments earlier. It's normally supposed to be Department of Agricultural, but if it's from somebody else, it means they received that on your behalf. It's a nominee payment, and they had to turn around and send the 1099-G to you. So that can be an occasion where you may come across that. So a lot of other things all in here, but it's just kind of as we interpret those, there's a lot of great information right within the forms themselves. Have a lot of super great instructions. If you look at whatever the wording here says recipient, when it looks at the instructions for recipient, those are valuable because it tells you what each of the boxes are for, just in a nutshell, without going to the full-blown instructions. most of the instructions for the person sending it are just due dates. So this one says, send it to the recipient by January 31st. You send it to the IRS by February 28th or April 1st of electronic. So it's not real in detailed and lengthy for the payer, but on the back page of these little forms, you'll see the instructions for the recipient go into a little more detail about the boxes too.